This week on the BackTable podcast.
I think that was the first step. As you know, my wife is a surgeon as well. And so that was a big part of it. You know, we had to have a talk about, okay, globally, what is the type of career I want to have? And what is the impact for us together? And kind of, are there any, strict limitations on, say, moving to some other place in the country or maybe things like that? But beyond that, thinking about, how do we do a search for a job together and kind of make sure that we have family things taken care of, but also having a really good and frank conversation about how having satisfaction, at least in whatever job it is that we ended up in, would be important for our family lives too.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the BackTable podcast, your source for all things urology. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at backtable.com. First, a brief word from our sponsors.
From concept to completion, there's a lot to consider when building a theranostics or PSMA PET-CT imaging program. It's nearly impossible to be an expert in every aspect of this care pathway, but the success of your program depends on it. Get the support you need from an experienced team. Open your web browser and search Siemens Healthineers Theranostics. You'll see the complete theranostics care pathway and how they can help you customize it to meet the needs of your prostate cancer patients. Visit their website or stop by Siemens Healthineers booth at the local and national American Urological Association and large urology group practice association meetings. You deliver the care, they'll deliver the rest.
Now, let's get back to the show. All right, good afternoon, Gene. I'm very excited to be here with you to have this conversation. For our listeners, I have Dr. Eugene Shkolyar here with me, and we are going to talk about getting your first job out of training. And Gene, I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute. I won't spoil your thunder on that. But for everyone that's listening, I imagine there are a lot of people that have been in the situation of having finished training or gotten close to the end of training and tried to figure out, how do I get my first job? Until you finish training, every other position up to that point is kind of algorithmic. You go to college, you take some tests, and you apply to medical school. You get into where you get in, and you pick and you go. Same thing from med school to residency. And if you do fellowship, from residency, fellowship. But getting that first job is actually so different than any of the other steps before it. And that's what we're going to spend time talking about. And I can't think of anybody more perfect for that conversation than my esteemed colleague and guest for today, Dr. Eugene Shkolyar. So Gene, who are you? Why am I talking to you?
Thanks so much, Jay. I'm Eugene Shkolyar. I'm currently a clinical assistant professor at Stanford, and I focus on urologic oncology. But most importantly, I just completed my SUO fellowship at Stanford, and so I had the opportunity of going through a job search and learning all the ins and outs of that process.
Perfect. Yeah, so you are fresh out of the process we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about here. You finished training, and towards the end of your training, in your case, fellowship, you had to figure out what you were going to do with your life. You had to go apply or go send emails, cold call people, walk up to people at various conferences, etc. So tell me about your process. Tell me what you wish you'd known. Tell me how it felt overall for you to get your job. Was it something that was stress-free and chill and you just sat back, or was it a little different perhaps?
Yeah, I think that certainly chill and laid back is not the way I would describe it. I think there definitely is some stress involved. And I think, as you had mentioned, you go through your entire training. You go to undergrad, you take your MCAT, go to medical school, then you're kind of locked in. In a lot of ways, your choices are not necessarily your own. You submit a rank list and you go somewhere for residency, similar for fellowship, and you're so kind of in this pathway where you, in some ways, let destiny take you where it's taking you. But then when you finally look for a job, it's a bit of a different ballgame. And I think that the biggest thing is just coming to that realization that you end up having to do a lot more legwork and introspection, really, than you anticipated. So I think probably that's the first step, if anything. I think coming to that realization, half a year out from finishing up and saying, oh man, I have to think about what is it that I want? How do I find those things and how do I leverage the resources around me to get there?
Got it. Would you say that the process was fun?
Yeah, I think it is fun. And I think the reason it's fun is because you do get to start to explore and see things, that are out there that you may not have known about. A lot of us train at, big medical academic centers, and we have a certain experience there, and what we're exposed to ends up actually just being a slither of what's available and out there. And you see it a lot from the trainee perspective. You certainly see how your faculty kind of deal with their jobs and kind of negotiate things and what their lives are like externally. But when you actually try to put yourself into their shoes, it's a bit different. And it's both a little bit nerve-wracking, but also really exciting to play with those options and to try to imagine where your career can take you. And I think that part is really a big chunk of it, which is getting out of that trainee mindset and thinking, okay, what is it that I want for my career and my life?
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you put it that way, because I think that's exactly right. I think one way to look at this process is to see it as terrifying and to see it as destabilizing. Oh my gosh, what will I do with my life? A lot of the folks who are looking for that first job very often have families that they've already started, or they have other responsibilities, and there's this huge pressure of, I've got to get a job. I've got to make sure I get a job. And most people, because we're in urology, have a mindset of there's only a narrow set of jobs that will fit. Geographically, I think I want to be in this area, or from a subspecialty standpoint, I need to have a job in this subspecialty. And you add both of those together, you think, oh man, there's not many jobs. Every year ever that I've been sort of observing fellows or residents going through the process, I hear the same things. This looks like it's going to be a tough year. There's not that many things out there. And yet, if you look back, every year, most people end up employed. I'm sure there's some that don't, and I don't mean to belittle those who have a harder time with it, but most people do end up finding a job. And the other way to look at it, as opposed to just terrifying, is, wow, what an awesome process I get to go through, because now, for the first time, I get to call some shots. Almost nobody, and I was guilty of this, when you go through it, sees it that way, but that's a very valid way to look at it, saying, hey, I get to decide what I want to be doing with my life. I'm having a conversation with someone, not for a rank list, but to have a two-way discussion about what I'm looking for, what I'm offering, what the groups or programs that I'm talking to are looking for, and what they're offering me. And it really, truly is a two-way exchange. So often, I think our trainees coming toward the end of their training don't see it that way. And I think they do a disservice to themselves when you feel like, I need to just impress these people and get a job. And that's actually the whole genesis for this episode. As I mentioned to you earlier, Gene, I was talking to one of our fellows here about some of the ways I think about these things. And she said, oh man, I think we should make sure everyone that's applying for a job hears this stuff, because there's a lot in there that would be really helpful to people through this process. So I'm hoping to unearth a lot of those issues with you during this episode.
I think that's a really great point, and the one that you bring up of, we're so used to going through this all and wanting to impress whoever it might be, your research PI, your attending, your program director, your fellowship director, and your chair. And while it's important to maintain those relationships, I think that sometimes as we're going through the grind of training, we lose sight a little bit of what it is that's the most important to us. And we do kind of get into this very narrow view of everything that's going on around us. And I think that that's kind of the first step of the job hunt for me was kind of recognition of that, and just taking a step back and saying, I'm pretty sure I know what I want, but am I certain of it? And how do I figure that out? And how do I just learn more and talk to people and not just assume I'm going to continue down this same path that I'm on, and kind of exploring both what I needed and wanted from a family and a life perspective, but also what I actually wanted from my job as opposed to what maybe other people expected me to have from my job. And I kind of, one of the interesting things that you started to mention a little bit is, the first things that you hear when you start looking for a job is people say, oh, there's going to be a limited supply of jobs, and there are these factors that are involved in the job hunt, and there's geography and there's practice type, and you're going to have to compromise on something. And it's a common thing that you actually hear people say. And I think that when you look at that at face value, that may be true, but I think starting off with that view, I actually thought that didn't really work for me, because it felt right away off the bat as if you were in a fight or kind of trying to get something that you were being denied or something like that. But my approach to it was to maybe see it as, how do I optimize the things that are important to me? And then what are the opportunities around that to make this into a job and a career that I would really enjoy?
Yeah, I think that's such a key point. I want to sort of restate what you said in there a minute or so ago. By definition, until you get to the end of training, you are essentially in an academic setting, because that's what academic means. It's training, it's sort of doing research, etc. And as a resident or a fellow, you are in an academic training environment. And there are so many trainees that I've spoken to in the past who feel this pressure to please the folks that are around them, for example, in their training program, and feel like, well, I think I should do a fellowship, or I think I should take an academic job. And I always tell people the first step, and I remember telling you this, to figure out what you want. Turn off all the other noise, turn off all the other signals, and figure out what you want. Even if you are at the number one ranked program and everyone loves you and you're the darling and they say you should go into academics, if that's not what you want, you need to think long and hard before you apply for academic type positions or further training. If you're getting pressure from other sources telling you, hey, you've been in school, quote unquote, forever, it's time you start bringing home the bacon, we have responsibilities, I really, really want you to be in private practice. If that's not what you want, taking that kind of a job may still leave you dissatisfied, and you're going to set yourself up 5-7 years later to have that very well-known sort of midlife crisis, what am I doing with myself, etc. So I always advise people, the first thing is, what do you want? Not your lab mentor, not your chair, not your program director, not your parents, not your life partner, but what is it that you want? Of course, these other people are critical voices to help you figure that out, because many of those people that I just mentioned know you really well and can advise you and can give you different perspectives. Ultimately, you need to figure out, what is it that I want?
And I think that that's an amazing point, and there's so many parts of that. And I think that's kind of, if you were to do the play-by-play of, okay, so how'd you do it? How do you make the decision? I think that was the first step. As you know, my wife is a surgeon as well. And so that was a big part of it. We had to have a talk about, okay, globally, what is the type of career I want to have, and what is the impact for us together? And kind of, are there any, strict limitations on, say, moving to some other place in the country or maybe things like that? But beyond that, thinking about, how do we do a search for a job together and kind of make sure that we have family things taken care of, but also having a really good and frank conversation about how having satisfaction, at least in whatever job it is that we ended up in, would be important for our family lives too, because I think that being able to find a job, a position that, motivates you and encourages you and makes you happy to show up to work is a really big deal. And I think that making sure that whoever else you have in your family, partners, children, parents, are on board with that and kind of also provide their perspective, at least, maybe not drive things necessarily, but at least so that you can have a sense of their input as you're making kind of that list. And so, what I did actually is I sat down, and I think you had advised me to do this at some point, is just to sit down, open a book and write down, okay, what do I want to be doing, or what do I want people to know me for in 5 years? And I think that's really different when you just sit down and do it for yourself, as opposed to, that's a common question you might ask in residency interviews or fellowship interviews. And there's the canned answer that you give other people. But just sitting down to get that one-liner. And it actually took me probably 2 months to write down that one sentence on a piece of paper. And I think that was a big deal. And then what I did is I took that sentence and I went to my wife and I said, hey, I want you to read this. I want to hear your thoughts on it. I feel pretty strongly about this, but let's use this as our starting point about where I want to end up. And then you can help me and kind of give me your input. And then I did that with my mentors and all sorts of other people too.
Yeah, there's a polarity here. The one side of it is just looking out for yourself and making sure you're doing the thing that you truly want to do. And that's the side I just spoke to. The other side of the polarity is what you were alluding to earlier, which is wanting to please those around us, whether it's folks in your program or the folks at home, etc. And I think the right answer is somewhere in between, being able to balance the two poles of the polarity. How can you both advocate for yourself and what you need and entertain multiple perspectives? And I think you have to know each of these before you can balance them appropriately. So let's go back to your case. So you figured out that this is what you want for whatever it was for you, which, given that you're at Stanford, I'm going to assume is academics. I know the answer to that. But what else were you thinking through? What were the other factors that went into your decision in terms of the programs that you reached out to?
I think that one of the first things, once I established, if you looked at what I wrote down in my book, I said, I want a career where I can be doing only cancer surgery and having the ability to be a very productive surgeon and still have access to research and clinical trials. And I left it kind of broad in that way. And then when I started there, I think one of the first things was being really open to different possibilities. I was pretty set on academics from the get-go, but I realized that was, mostly because of comfort and familiarity and thinking, I can only do what it is that I want in academia. And I think just doing a check on that was actually really helpful. I, spoke to a few people who were outside of academia, actually, at different sorts of practice settings. And a lot of it was just information gathering and trying to get a sense of, what are the alternatives? What else is out there? Are there community practices that can still provide a career that ends in that same goal, of accomplishing that in my career? And the first thing actually is you get, in my opinion, pleasantly surprised by some of the options that are out there to kind of craft or develop the career you want. And, it ranges from things like something that is kind of pre-baked to help you achieve those goals, all the way to things that are a bit of a open adventure where if you plan and put in the hard work, you could potentially build something like that. And so just even hearing those different perspectives outside of academia, I thought was a really big deal. And I think ultimately it helped me actually be that much more sure of my eventual decision to stay in academia and to stay at Stanford, having gotten a really good lay of the land and not just having, tunnel vision, I'm going to work in academics, I'm only going to talk to academics. And for me, I think that was just an important experience to learn about the rest of the world and what people do out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really healthy approach that you took. In general, I think no matter how certain you are of a certain path like this, for me, I've tried to follow the idea of still look at the other path, just so you're making a truly informed decision. If you come in from day one knowing that you only want to do academics, you only apply to academic places and you get an academic job, I hope that works out for you. I truly do. But there's a possibility you may never experienced something that might have worked out differently, maybe better for you. So I think for people who are very certain they want to do academics, looking at a private practice job or a couple of jobs is not a bad thing. If anything, it might actually either make you realize, oh, wait, this is actually something I can see myself doing. I am glad I looked into this. Or, yeah, this is definitely not for me. And you feel that much more validated that you were truly making an informed choice. So I remember when you were going through this, you looking at various types of jobs. And I think that was wise because you can go forward feeling very good about the path that you've chosen.
When you were, Jay, looking for a job, did you also try to search outside of academia, or were you pretty set on staying in academia?
No, I was fairly certain that I wanted to do academics, but I spoke to several private practices, just to learn what was out there. I knew I would likely not accept any of them, but I see it as helpful because then when I talk to other people now who are looking at private practice jobs, I feel like at least I have some sense of what they might be looking for or what's out there in terms of possibilities for them. As I was saying, I think it's very healthy to look. Even after I took my first academic job, and as you know, I was at MD Anderson, I would occasionally get requests to interview for jobs elsewhere. Places that, I'll be honest, I had zero interest in going, but I would go and look anyway because, like I said, if nothing else, it made me feel validated that, yeah, you know what? This place that I am is the right place for me. And if I'm being completely honest, one place that called out of the blue that I had no interest in going was this place in Palo Alto called Stanford. And I said, well, I know for a fact I'm really happy at MD Anderson, but in keeping with my philosophy, I'm going to go take a look, just to take a look. And obviously, fast forwarding, I am now at Stanford. It turned out that I was very happy at MD Anderson, but it was also the right time for me to make a move. And I ended up ultimately going down that other path. So I think sometimes we surprise ourselves. We think we know ourselves deeply, and sometimes we need to get out of our own thinking and realize that, oh, actually what I thought I wanted isn't what I want. And I'm so happy with where I ended up with that decision.
Yeah, I think another point is, in addition to, at least for me, helping me figure out what it is that I wanted and kind of where I could build something for myself, there's this whole other layer of learning about how healthcare is structured in general and how departments are organized or how different systems have a different way of administering and things of that nature. And just getting a foundation of that actually from talking to all these different people helped me understand when I did look at academic jobs that they're also not all the same. And there's a lot of variability in, structure, in roles. For example, we have more research line folks, we have clinical line folks, and that's not necessarily going to be the structure at other places. And just getting an understanding of just the inner workings of these institutions regardless, and how things like hiring works, contract negotiations, working on requests or things that you might want to set up, and how clinics are structured, and getting some of that experience from different systems, whatever they might be, and figure out how they might apply where you end up, I think is also just important for when you do finally settle on a job and then start trying to build your practice.
I think what you're saying in a very kind way is perhaps that as a trainee, you don't actually know much of anything about how the real world works. That's what I heard you say. That's the Gene interpretation of that line. And I remember that for me, and I've seen that other people sort of convey that same feeling. When you are a resident or even a fellow, the things that you're focused on are almost irrelevant to what your life looks like as a day-to-day attending. As residents, we spend most of our time especially in urology, just wanting to be in the operating room, just wanting to do the big cases, wanting to get your case logs, and there's a juicy caval thrombus, there's a juicy cystectomy. I'm going to do those cases. If we're being completely honest, for the majority of urology graduates, they're not doing those cases ever again. And I think it is so valuable to be exposed to those things so you know when to refer them, you know when to recognize those conditions, etc. But what we don't spend time doing is learning, how does somebody run a practice? How does someone build a referral base? How does someone take care of a patient beyond just prepping and draping and cutting? There's the arc of patient care is so much larger than what we as trainees are exposed to seeing. And we don't spend any time looking at those things. I've heard it said before, even if you're, to your point earlier, if you're sure you want to go into academics, just because you're at one program, you can't assume that that's what other programs are like. The phrase is, if you've seen one academic urology department, you've seen one academic urology department. Every other one is a little bit different. Same thing with private practice. No two of anything is the same. So you kind of have to go see a bunch of different ones to get a true sense of what is the universe of possibilities out there so you can make an informed decision.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. Just to last time echo it is because you don't really know any of these things. I remember talking to someone and they were explaining to me how they go about, picking which cystoscopes they're going to have in clinic and how many you have to have for how many patients you see. And I just remember being dumbfounded. That thought had never crossed my mind to know how many cystoscopes you have to have available and product, and kind of figuring out if that's something that you do want to manage and don't.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. The title of this podcast is Getting Your First Job. And right now we've spent time going through the thought process of approaching the job hunt. But what do you actually do? How do you get a job? There are right now lots of PGY 4 or 5 residents, lots of first-year fellows who are thinking, okay, it's now almost May. My last year's coming up in July. I'm going to start looking for a job. And I'll tell you right now, everyone has this crazy notion that, you know what? I'm going to have my job finalized before I start my chief year. I'm going to have that signed contract before I get into that last year. And for everyone that's listening, I'll tell you that almost never happens. So sorry to disappoint you, but you kind of have to, it's a longer process than that. And you kind of have to be patient because a lot of the jobs that you want also don't open up that far in advance. You'd hate to sign somewhere on a dotted line before July of your final year, and then your dream job opens up in October or December or February even. So it's actually not a bad thing that you may not have your job all squared away by July of your final year. So Gene, back to my question. How do you start? What is the first thing you did? What were you told to do? What was your understanding? What would you tell somebody else now to actually start getting the job?
Yeah, I think that where I started at least was, having established what it is that I want and getting a sense, okay, I know that this is the type of practice I want to be. And then the next thing that really came to mind was geography. My wife and I, we sat down, we talked, we said, okay, these are some cities that, we might have family, we've spent time there, we have ties there, or might be fun places to live. And we made our list together and then looked at the institutions that are there. And that was, I think, a really big thing because it helps to reveal, preferences and other things you might be thinking about. Then, once we had that list, we said, okay, where are the programs there? Or where are the opportunities in these places? And I think taking that approach and just setting those kind of global goals is a nice way of doing it. On occasion, we look at some of the job boards, for example, but it's a little hard to do that sometimes. It's a little daunting just to scroll through the list and see, oh, this looks cool, this is interesting, I don't know about that. And I think that oftentimes that it's not necessarily reflective of what might be out there. So, we made a list of a few places, and my first step actually was, I reached out to mentors. So I reached out to you. I reached out to one of my other close mentors, actually, Joe Liao, I've spent a lot of time with and have done research with. And I said, hey, these are some places I think I'd really enjoy living, and they have some great institutions there. And do you know anyone there? Can you reach out? Do you know what's going on? And I think that was step number one. And I think that, that was one of the things that when I had met with you, you talked about doing and keeping an eye out for that.
Yeah, the two things I've heard people say in this regard are, one, geography is really a driving force for us. And very often what you'll hear people say is, we want to be near my family, or we want to be near my partner's family. And obviously, if that's a key thing, that's super important. I've heard other people say, it's really important for me to have the best academic job I can have. I'm untethered otherwise. I'm free. I will go wherever. My spouse is also up for going wherever, or I don't have a spouse and I'm open to being in any part of the country. I really think that I want a job in academics. I think a lot of trainees don't use their mentors enough, honestly. And I know it probably comes from a good place of, oh, they're busy. I don't want to bother them, etc. I don't even know where I want to be yet. And I would encourage residents who are just about to embark on that process to lean on your mentors, to have those questions. I've covered mentoring in a previous podcast episode, but I think there's a way to engage mentors to be more or less helpful. And this is something that really pays off to have the mentors be more helpful. Just picking their brain, saying, hey, I just want to talk through what I'm thinking about and just want to reflect it off somebody that I trust, that I know has my best interests at heart, and see what they say. And urology, as you know, is a relatively small field. I don't think there's a single state where I don't have someone that I'd consider a close colleague or a good friend in the field. So most people, if they say, oh, I'm interested in this geography or that geography, for me, at least one, usually a handful of names come to mind of, oh, you ought to consider this for what you're looking for. This is a place to consider, etc. And I think engaging those mentors is key. So let's say you do that. Let's say you've had all the conversation. Let's say you've written in your book to figure out who you are. You've held multiple perspectives of the other important people in your life. You've identified some places. You've spoken to your mentors. What do you actually do? How does the job do? Do you just go to ChatGPT, find me the perfect first job out of urology? Bam, done.
Well, maybe that would work now. It'd be good to try that
in another year or two. Yeah. What's the best job for me?
Yeah, you just type in all your personality traits and it'll spit it right back at you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. So I had a multi-pronged approach, I suppose. For some people, when you have mentors who are really close friends at other places, you just ask for an introductory email. Hey, I'm going to be at AUA or SUO. Would love to hear if you foresee any openings or any opportunities. And not necessarily waiting for a job to be posted or have anything available, just connecting. Because, sometimes that connection could spark some thinking or maybe give you just some more information about some of those places. So, hey, I had, people shoot emails and say, hey, could you come meet with Gene when we're at some meeting? And I would try to meet with people as much as I could. And we would discuss those same things of what I'm looking for, getting a sense of if there were any jobs available at these various institutions. And I think that was really important. A, it just helps with general networking and it kind of gets you in touch with people who have a sense of what's going on. And B, I think sometimes it opens up some opportunities that maybe weren't there necessarily, or that maybe you're just in their really early phases when you kind of present yourself to someone as a potential candidate for a role. So just actually making that connection and trying to meet in person or to chat and exploring what the options are. And I think in addition to mentors, I think leaning on some prior co-residents or co-fellows, I think is also really important. I think sometimes they have a good sense of what the lay of the land is, especially if, someone who just graduated a year ago or 2 years ago, they might know, hey, this program was a few years out from hiring someone, or I heard, at such and such meeting that this other place might be looking. And to do that and to start just talking to people and sending them your CV and letting them know you're interested. And then similarly, I ended up staying at Stanford, obviously, reaching out, if you're interested in reaching out to your chair and the key players at your home department to try to figure out, is there a possibility of doing that and what might that look like and how you could get that?
Yeah, I think there's two really important points in there. Number one, I think you have to do some of the work yourself. I think you've got to feel comfortable walking up to people. If you see them at the AUA or if you see them at your society subspecialty meeting, going up, people forget the power of a genuine smile. Hi, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jay. I want to let you know I'm a fourth-year resident starting to look for jobs. But just walking up to someone confidently, not arrogantly, not cockily, but just with a confident, hi, I want to say hello. that goes a really long way to starting the conversation and engaging, like you said, the folks in the field that are your mentors or they're at your home programs. And the advice I give people is that if you walk up to your chair or program director and say, hey, I heard there's an opening at blank institution. Do you know anyone or can you reach out, etc.? You're kind of hoping that they'll do that. And I can tell you for a fact they want to do that and they mean to do that. And you have to keep in mind that they're also very busy. So what I recommend to people usually is say, hey, ask that person in person and then send them an email saying, thanks so much for agreeing to reach out on my behalf to blank. Here is their email address because you've looked it up, you've given the email address and said, here's some words to use if you need. And a lot of times your chairwoman will be friends with someone, they don't need that. But in case they don't have that close connection, saying, oh, Eugene Shkolyar is a graduating resident in our program. He's done a lot of work in, fill in the blank here. He's really interested in your program. I think it'd be a great fit. Or he's from that area and his family's there and I know he would like to be there and he's a rock star and I think you ought to take a hard look at him. Just make it simple for your mentors to serve you well. Take all that extra work off their plate. And as a bonus, you get to control the narrative of what it is that these people are first hearing about you. Obviously, if you make stuff up that's not true, your chair's going to look at it and say, wait, what? You didn't win the Nobel Prize. Why is that in there? That's not going to serve you well. But, highlight your own strengths. And that gets to the next point I want to really highlight here. You have to get comfortable talking about yourself positively. We are all so hardwired to not be arrogant and to not seem cocky that sometimes we overdo it and we give away our confidence a little bit. So you have to be able to say good things about yourself. If you've ever had to write a recommendation letter for yourself, and I think most people at some point have to help somebody have a starting point for a letter, it's hard to do. It's hard to brag. It's so much easier to brag about somebody else than it is about yourself. But you are, in essence, selling yourself, and you have to be able to highlight your strengths as you go through this process.
I was just going to say, I totally agree with that. I think it's really uncomfortable for a lot of us to do that, and it can be unnatural. But I think if you get to meet someone in person and get to hear them talk about themselves and what they're interested in, whatever that might be, I think that's just so much stronger than, an email or an application through a job site with a CV. And I think, it can really open up doors and set you up.
So I want to transition for the last 10 minutes or so to once you've actually identified a job. So, you've gone through the thought process that you outlined earlier. You've enlisted your mentors. You've reached out on your own. You've narrowed it down to a couple of places. And now you're down to either one place and you're in a negotiation part, or the one or two places and you're trying to weigh, well, which of these should I take, etc. So I want you to talk a little bit, and I have some thoughts I'll share as well, about what are the factors that are important. How did you handle that negotiation? Was there any negotiation for you?
This is where, going back to your roots for me was really helpful of what was my original goal and what was it that I wanted to achieve. You set your ideal, your optimal situation, and you go out, you explore, you talk to people, you meet people, you figure out where there are opportunities, and, you interview. And then after that, you got to make a decision. And there's so many different factors, right, that play into it. A lot of small details, a lot of not so small details. And I think for me, a lot of it was coming back to, okay, big picture, what do I think is going to let me go back to that goal, that one-liner that I had in my book when I wrote down my initial objectives? And then it's a lot of little picture stuff that I think can end up being important. And, that could vary for all sorts of people. It could be location-based, it could be salary-based, it could be protected time-based and how much, is allocated for things like research. And I think another big thing is also realizing that often it can be flexible too. And I think that's another important point. And I think you learn that as you go through the process and hear about the different jobs and trying to figure out what it is that is really important for you to be able to adjust or negotiate, which I think is important. And so to be more concrete, I wanted to make sure that I had a robust clinical practice, but I also wanted to make sure I, had an opportunity to do a lot of teaching and participate in research and trials. And a good balance that worked out for me was my split time at Stanford, when I did eventually decide on this job, allowed me to be at the university campus 75% of the time, then 25% at the VA. And I think being able to have those kind of two different practice settings wrapped together is pretty unique. And the reason I think that was pretty nice for me to have is I wanted to make sure I knew that I was staying, at my program where I had done training. And one of the worries I had was, is there going to be room for me to innovate or to do things differently? Or am I just continuing on that path? And having that nice mix between those two settings, I think really set me up to be able to create this little bit of a more unique practice, and also to take a little bit of weight off of having to necessarily hit the ground running 100% at a really busy university setting. I also got to talk about doing some outreach stuff and a little bit of practice building, which I thought would be a really nice opportunity to do something new, go out to one of our different sites and figure out what it is like to count the cystoscopes and know how much you have to do and kind of build a network of patients and providers that you work with and potentially increase our presence. And so for me, I think that was a nice additional kind of challenge that I could add to my job. And so I think, negotiating things like where are you exactly, how much time you have for things like administrative work, research. Another big thing that comes up for a lot of people in academics and even outside of academics is negotiating startup packages for research, for example, and what that might look like. In addition to that, considering resources, are there research coordinators available? Are there statisticians? Do you have access to those people if you're interested in that? If you're in a different sphere, it might be a whole different host of people. Even in some community practices, they have very robust research infrastructures, and figuring out, okay, how do I get access to that? Is that something that I negotiate now? And getting a sense of that. So I think those are some of the first things.
Yeah, you just listed a lot of different factors that went into your thought process in the negotiating phase. I think negotiating, by the time most people get to that, people do it so poorly, so often. It's actually painful to watch. I think the process of finding that job is so drawn out and filled with stress that by the time they've narrowed it down, they've already done all this work of, okay, this is the job for me, and don't realize that, yes, this is the place for you that you've sort of narrowed it down to. And there are all these other factors that can shape that job in completely different ways to make it better or worse for yourself. Most people, when they talk about a job, they think, how much am I getting paid? And if it's academic, what's my split? Am I 80-20? Am I 50-50, 20-80, 70-30? But they don't realize there are so many other factors involved. You named a whole bunch of them as well. Are you going to the VA? Or you going to the satellite hospital? Do you have administrative support? Not even just access to research support, but do you have an administrative assistant that can help you do things like book your travel or book your meetings, these kind of things? I think we could have a whole nother podcast episode on how to be more efficient in your practice, but we won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But there are a million things that you can negotiate. And the important thing to remember is not all of the different factors that we're talking about here are equally important to both sides. So it may be super important to you that you have X days of clinic, or it may not be important to you at all, but it's really important to the person on the other side of the negotiating table, whether it's your chair of the academic department or the head of the group. And realizing that different factors have different weights, you can say, hey, you know what? I see that it's really important for you that I only make X amount. To me, it's really important that I have this many days of vacation. So yeah, I'll take that salary cap you're giving me for the first year, and can you give me this? And there's a lot of room in there that people just leave a lot of factors unaddressed and just say, well, this is just how it is. Once you start listing it, you realize there's, like I said, there's admin support, there's things like vacation time, there's things like titles, especially when you're starting out. If you're in academics, titles can be important. Titles can be meaningful for people. But these things are important. And what I think disadvantages a lot of trainees, getting back to the point we started with at the beginning of this podcast, it's the first time you're going through this process. Whereas for the head of the group that's negotiating with you, or the department chair that's negotiating with you, they've likely done it multiple times. So the metaphor I always use, and hopefully for those that have young kids, this will resonate. If your kid walks up to you on a Tuesday and says, "Oh, hey, Dad, I want ice cream," you can easily say, "Sorry, Bella, Tuesday's not an ice cream night. Go ice cream." And Bella doesn't know any better, so she walks up and says, "Oh, darn it, Tuesday's not an ice cream night." When, in fact, there's no reason Tuesday can't be an ice cream night. You're just saying that. You're making that up. And sometimes I think some of that same logic goes into the negotiating aspect. Because the trainees don't know what to ask for, when they get a no, it's just, "Oh, darn it, shucks, okay. And I've already decided this is the job for me, so I'll just take it. I'll be a good person and I'll suck it up." For us in medicine, in these difficult surgical specialties, our super egos are so developed that we can grind through anything. So these things don't even feel like a grind. Like, "Oh, I would have liked to have this, but since they said it's not possible, I guess it's not possible." And the advice I always give is just get used to life giving you the easy no. Almost everything you ever ask for, it's easier for the other side to say, "No, sorry, can't do it." Our job, the trick, is to figure out how to hold steady through that easy no and work your way to the creative yes. And I think that applies for things like job settings as well. As you know, Gene, I coach a lot of junior faculty in terms of career development, professional development, etc. And one of the things that I often end up speaking to my colleagues that I coach over and over again is, yes, you got told no, and you can either get mad or disappointed or say, "Screw it, I'm done with this place," and start looking at other tempting places, etc. Or you can say, "Okay, I hear you say no, and I respect that here's why, and I think this is valuable, and I want to work with you to figure out how this might be possible." And if you can navigate that conversation respectfully and calmly, you'll be amazed at the number of times that initial no can get transformed into that really fulfilling, yes, actually that is possible. And same exact analogy here for jobs. You don't want to be rude. You don't want to be bullheaded and say, "You said no, I think that's crap." Oh, can I say that in the podcast? So let's just go with it. "I think that's crap," and you push. You're not trying to alienate people. What you're trying to do is represent your perspective respectfully in a way that the other person can hear it. You invite them to work with you to get to that point where you can both walk away feeling happy. It's not a fixed pie where if you get something, I lose it, or if I get something, you lose it. It's how can we work through this issue to come to a solution set that grows the pie in the largest way possible, where we can all feel like, hey, we really won from that.
I totally agree. And, there's, like you mentioned, there's all these different points. And I actually, from a practical standpoint, I actually made an Excel sheet and I listed all those factors. What's my split? What's my OR time possibly going to be like? Where am I going to be? What expectations do I have? Other roles and future goals, and kind of wrote them down. But I think big picture, that willingness to explore crafting a little bit what the position could be and not just accepting, okay, this is what it is on paper. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show up and do it for 30 years. And again, I think that's where not coming into it saying, all right, well, I know I'm going to have to compromise. I'm compromising on these things. I'm just going to give it up. But trying to make it into something that you can enjoy now and that can build out later, whatever it is that might be.
It also sets the tone for your relationship with these folks that you'll be working with. If you can engage respectfully early on and make everyone feel good about what the ultimate outcome is, that also sets the expectation of, hey, this is someone that we can work with, that's going to be constantly thinking not just for himself or herself. Because you hear that. You'll hear chairs talking about junior faculty sometimes who are just cool. He'll come off very self-centered. Like, you know what? They don't do anything for the department or for the group. They just always take. And they don't feel like they're giving. And that's not, you don't want to enter a practice with these folks thinking that about you. Gene, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I think we should wrap up in the next couple minutes. But I want to ask you one more question before I invite you to sort of make any closing comments. What's the worst piece of advice you got during this? And I purposely didn't tell you beforehand I was going to ask you that because I want the unfiltered answer.
Oh man, I think one of the issues is there is so much bad advice out there, and kind of you don't even know if you're getting bad advice because sometimes it's coming from people who you respect and you really look up to, and sometimes they don't necessarily have the best kind of thoughts about certain things. I'd say there's a handful of things, right? I think one of the pieces of advice that I thought was not great is, again, like, well, you're going to have to compromise anyway. It's good enough. That's one thing, which I think is not a very satisfying way to wrap up, 5 to 7 years of training, and then I think that one of the other things that you'll hear on occasion is, oh, it's just a job. You're only going to be there 40 or 60 hours a week. Like, who cares? It's not what you want, but it's a job. And yes, it is. Certainly there's a lot that we have going on in our lives, but I think that it's hard to separate those things, right? And it's, your happiness at work and having something that you find fulfilling and rewarding is important. It's going to impact the rest of you. And I think so you shouldn't just kind of dismiss it outhand and just take whatever is the highest salary or, the best day-to-day schedule to get Fridays off or whatever that might be. And then finally, I think, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, is, sometimes you have the overzealous mentor a little bit who really is trying to be very helpful, but is sometimes trying to steer you into a path that might not be your own. And it's really easy to get lost in that path and just follow down that way and forget what it is that you want. And so I think just being aware of what it is that you need for yourself and how that might interact with the people around you, and making sure that, again, you're looking to start your career in a way that is going to be fruitful and make you successful. And I think that is very individual.
Gene, I hear you with the worst advice you got. And I have to be honest, when I first started to ask you that question, I realized as soon as I finished, what if he says something I told him? And it made me nervous. So I appreciate that you didn't repeat any of my advice as bad advice, although I'm sure I've dispensed plenty of it. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk about your process in terms of getting a first job. I know there's a lot of stress involved in it, not just for you, but for everyone that goes through this process. And I think you've shared a lot of really valuable learnings from your own experience over the last couple of years. And I hope for everyone that's listening out there, I hope that this was helpful. I hope as you go through your own job process, this validates that you're not the only one that thinks it's scary and confusing, because it is right now scary and confusing. I would encourage you to lean on your mentors and other folks who are a little further along in the process than you might be, and leverage them to help you. They all want to help. All of us who are in the field, who are not in our first job, or who are not just about to finish training, want to make sure that those folks that we train and that we serve end up in good places and find jobs that are meaningful for them. Gene, I'll let you close it out with any final reflections or last thoughts that you want to share, or any words of wisdom that you want to give to those who are either in the job hunt right now or will be entering shortly.
Yeah, I think, overall it's both a nerve-wracking and an exciting process, and lets you be creative, I think. And I think just trying to stay as positive as you can and knowing that you'll end up where you have to be. And the other piece of advice that I didn't mention before is it's okay if you don't sign your contract until way later. I don't think I did that until, May. So keep looking and don't feel that pressure.
Yeah, I love it. Have fun with it. Trust yourself, trust in the process, and realize that, this process is not meant to make you feel bad. It's meant to actually celebrate all the hard work you've done, and you're finally starting to actually work. You're no longer a student or trainee in your first job, so enjoy it. Well, awesome, Gene. Thank you so much for taking the time. And if you have any feedback on the episode, we'd love to hear it. We want to bring content that's meaningful and helpful. And if you have other ideas for other topics to discuss, reach out to me. I'm all ears. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend.
If you have any questions or comments, DM us at _BackTable on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter.
BackTable is hosted by Aditya Bagrodia
And Jose Silva.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Josh McWhirter,
Aaron Bowles,
Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Administrative support provided by Jamila Kennebrew.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.